Dulles Church family, close and far, welcome to this series. This is part 4 of our series, The Most Exciting Idea on Earth. And I want to just invite you to listen to last week's podcast. Last week, we did things a little bit differently. And so those of you outside the Dulles area, not at Lightridge, didn't have the opportunity to see or hear part 3 yet. So listen to our Dulles Church podcast on Spotify or iTunes to catch up on the series from last week. Okay, one of the common views of God in society today, and I hear this personally when people want to meet with me to talk about God, and I certainly see it in media everywhere. One of the common views of God today is that he's an angry God, or he's easily angered. And he quickly remembers wrongs of people's past. And that when God engages, when he engages humans, or when he just sort of randomly shows up in our lives, or with any kind of interest toward us, it's usually to punish us for stepping out of line. Now, my favorite TV series at the moment is not Stranger Things or The Mandalorian. Great series, and there's a lot of series that we have been watching this year. But my favorite series at the moment is Yellowstone. And I say this with some caution because Yellowstone is a pretty dark story. I don't know how many pastors watch Yellowstone. I certainly don't know how many would admit to watching it. It's pretty dark. It's a family drama. There's a lot of disturbing issues within this family. But it is so well written, and the acting is so great. And the scenery, I've told some friends, is like a leading character in the series. So Kevin Costner plays John Dutton, and it's really about John Dutton's family. And with all the dark and challenging stuff within the family, one of the dark elements or underlying elements to the story is that John Dutton views God as angry, as distant, and if he is real, God probably just wants to send John to hell. I mean, that's kind of his view. And you know, I got kind of my pastor hat on, I guess, when I'm watching it. I don't know how many people would really think this, but I believe John's view of God really affects his worldview. And it affects decisions that he makes and some of the crap and crisis that happen in this story. And it's so sad that our culture today has this notion about God, but it is catastrophically tragic that so many people within churches that sit in seats in churches and attend churches, people of the message of Jesus, actually share the same notion that God has entered our world to accept some people into heaven and send a lot of other people to hell. And so we're going to write that today by actually looking at the story of God. We're going to look at what God says about the way he interacts with us and the way his worldview, God's worldview, his view of our planet and particularly humans. Now, one of my favorite dialogues between the religious leaders of Jesus' day, the Pharisees, and Jesus, you know, they're at war with each other, and the Pharisees eventually have him crucified. One of my favorite elements of dialogue between them is when they are exacerbated at Jesus, at the kind of people that Jesus hangs out with. Here's one example. When the scribes of the Pharisees, these are the religious leaders of the Jewish people of Israel in Jesus' day, the leaders of the temple, and they're the experts in the law of Moses and the Old Testament. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that Jesus was eating with sinners and tax collectors who were considered traitors to the way of Israel for selfish gain, monetary gain, when Jesus was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does Jesus eat with despised tax collectors and with sinners?" He can't possibly be from God if he spends his time with these kinds of people. Here's my favorite. My favorite one of these examples is in Luke 15, the beginning of Luke 15. And this is from the Message version translation. By this time, a lot of men and women of questionable reputation were around Jesus, listening intently. But the Pharisees and religious scholars were not pleased, not at all pleased. They growled, "He takes in sinners and eats meals with them," treating them like old friends. And I love that Jesus was in trouble with the religious leaders because of the kind of people he spent time with. All right, now this is a setup to how we're going to look back at the early strategy that's revealed by God in his rescue plan. We've said throughout this series that God created a world that is good and perfect and very good. And if you think the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or places in Greece or these extraordinary, scenes that we've talked about in week 1, Ireland and Scotland and all of these amazing, breathtaking places on earth are inspiring, well, that's God's design. God intended you and me never to age and never have relational conflict. This was the garden. This was creation. And God said it's so good, meaning without flaw. And then humans broke creation by taking control. We tried to take control from God. And we want it to be the center of the universe. And we want it to live life our way. And early after that story, very early in Genesis still, we see what unfolds a rescue plan. That's how I've written about it for years. That's how I describe it. And so we're going to dive into this consistent engagement of God, the way he interacts with planet Earth in our broken, lost, confused, anxiety-ridden, so much lesser than he intended state that we're in this world that we call broken, that we at Dulles Church call broken. We're going to see in the very beginning pages of Genesis his strategy to rescue humanity and rescue the earth and eventually lead everything back to the garden, back to his intended version of creation, without flaw, without struggle, without death, in perfect community, people in perfect community, reflecting the nature and heart and good and character of God. Okay, so Genesis 12 is where we begin to see this revealed. I'm going to run through a few verses here quickly where we see the role of Israel. When we hear the word Israel today in church, we can think Old Testament. This is irrelevant to us. This is so relevant to eventually what Jesus calls you and me into in the movement of his church. At the very start of God's rescue plan, we see that the Lord says to Abram, the man who trusted God and trusted his control. Abram was a person who recognized who God was and that the world was designed to really work with God in control. And so God engages Abram and says, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. Now, this is Eden language. Abram is leaving the land that he's familiar with, and God is going to take him into something really good. And a land where God's character is going to be known. And God's way is going to produce life. And it's foreshadowing language of ultimately what God is going to redirect us all back toward this space of his presence, of his good, of his creativity, of his plan for humanity. Eventually we learn that this is a land that flows with milk and honey. God is directing Abram, he'll change his name later to Abraham, to this land that flows with milk and honey. I'm leading you out of the wilderness, out of the dry and barren land to this beautiful oasis of land with flowing water and milk that flows and honey that flows. Language so important in Abraham's day, certainly. In verse 2, I will make you into a great nation. Speaking of his descendants, the nation of Israel. Stay with me. I know we're talking about people long ago, and this is about the nation of Israel. But God's intention for Israel was not that they be like a favorite people He's going to reject all other nations or all other peoples, and he's only going to prioritize Israel. Listen to the purpose of Israel. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. He's still speaking to Abram here. And you will be a blessing, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. The role of Israel, the role of Abraham's descendants, was to be reflections of God's character, of God's truth, of how we're to actually experience God and experience good in this world. Let's skip ahead 10 chapters to Genesis 22. This story is still unfolding. Just a few verses here to set up where we're going today. God said to Abraham, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, God had asked Abraham to take his young son Isaac, who was the beginning of all of these descendants, and what would be the blessing of this people group, Israel, to the whole world, to every nation. The very first descendant was his son Isaac. God just, it seems so morbid that he would ask Abraham to sacrifice his son in this, up on this mountain. Later we learn, 2,500 years later, we're reading the story of Jesus and his crucifixion. How extraordinary that the place of Jesus' crucifixion is the same hill, this same small mountain where Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac. So Abraham obeys. He trusts God so much that he's willing to sacrifice his son. God stops him and says, no, Abraham, okay, stop. I'm going to provide you this lamb, sacrifice the lamb for the sins of the people. And so now he's saying, because you have done this and you have not withheld your son, even your own son, Abraham, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. This is speaking of the purpose of Israel, Abraham's descendants, but it's also foreshadowing language of the son who will be sacrificed. God is saying, I will actually be the father who literally sacrifices his son for the sake of all people, all nations. And what we're seeing here is the true heart of God, to lower himself because he loves us so much, to pay the cost, to face risk in order to be reunited with us so that our space and his space can overlap once again, so that we will be sharing space with God again. This is what the Garden of Eden was all about. All right, this is all a setup to the next book of the Bible, Exodus, where the strategy of the rescue plan really begins to unfold. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Moses had grown up in Pharaoh's home. He was an Israelite. He was a Hebrew, and yet through a long dramatic story, he ended up being rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and raised as an Egyptian in the home of Pharaoh. He's really the prince of Egypt, quite literally. And after a lot of turmoil and seeing behavior in the people of Egypt that he didn't like, and in conflict, Moses actually, in protecting Hebrew people, the lowly slaves of Egypt, he ends up in a fight with an Egyptian and murders him and tries to conceal it and bury it in the sand. Okay, so all of that has happened. A lot of time has passed, and now Moses is just a shepherd. He doesn't have any significant role. He's in this obscure job all by himself with a group of sheep, basically. He's on the far side of the wilderness. Not just in the wilderness, he's on the far side of the wilderness, which is significant. That really speaks to you and me when we can feel so far from God, or we wonder, does God see me? Is God going to show up in my life? Does God really have a plan for my life? And he comes to Horeb, the mountain of God, a place where God would choose to interact. This is a temple-like location where God's space interacts with human space again, like the garden. So Moses comes to this place. Verse 2, there the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, thinking, wow, this has my attention. Something extraordinary is happening here. I'll go over and see this strange sight, why this bush isn't burning up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him So we learn here that the presence, the angel of the Lord, as he's referred to, the presence in this bush is actually God. So this is God. His presence literally interacting again with humans, just like in the Garden of Eden. We've stated this is one of our driving beliefs here at Dulles, that we believe this is what God cares most about, that our space and his space would coexist. They would be one space. And we're getting a little glimpse of this here again. God called to Moses from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground." Now this is intimate, what's happening here. God is so personal. We're going to see that. We're going to see the extent of God's care and compassion. And yet, it's a profound place. Because God's presence is so close, God is telling Moses, take off your shoes, what carry dirt and filth and the grime of your shoes, remove them and recognize that you're standing in God's presence. So it's this tension between the profound and the sacred, and also the very personal, loving God that Moses is about to encounter. Then God said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac." These are the descendants who were introduced to God's rescue plan. The God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. When he hears, "Oh, I'm the father of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob," he's the creator God. This is God. This isn't some idol or some nationalistic idol of some kind. This is creator God who made the universe. That's what this means to Moses. So he hides his face. He doesn't want to look at God. This is rescue plan language. God had revealed to Abraham, "I'm going to raise up a group of people and you're going to lead all the nations of the earth back to my heart. You're going to reveal and reflect who I am. You're going to reveal to others, to all nations, who I am and what I'm like." And that was the beginning of God's rescue heart and intention revealed to Abraham. So Moses knows that, and he's hearing, this is who's speaking to me in this bush. So Moses is already aligning his heart with rescue strategy, which is what is about to unfold here. Then the Lord said in verse 7, "I have indeed seen." This is sensory language. God cares so much, he sees the misery of my people in Egypt. "I have heard them crying out." When God uses language of his own senses, of course God knows everything, he's omniscient, but he's telling Moses, "I see and I hear what your people are going through as slaves in Egypt. I see the condition of my people, the descendants of Abraham." This is intimate language. And now comes the emotional language. "Because of their slave drivers, I am concerned about their suffering," God says. He's saying, "I see and I hear them crying out, and I'm concerned." That's a word that refers to somebody's heart. Like I have emotion. I'm responding emotionally because of my concern or because I see and hear what's happening. This is very intimate and personal kind of language from this God, where we tend to see, we should take our shoes off. This is the fiery God in the bush. This is the loud God. Maybe he's angry, or I need to hide my face or I'm going to be killed. But no, the sacred is I'm standing before the God who's personally telling me how much he sees and cares and hears and is concerned for the struggle of his people. And by the way, this is a foreshadow of how God will reveal his concern for all people, all nations. This is not isolated simply to, I only care about the people of Israel. God's language and work and interaction with Israel is a foreshadow to what we will learn is his heart for all people. And ultimately, the church would be called the new Israel. We would be called to be the reflectors and image bearers of God, and we will be ultimately the ones to be a blessing to the whole world in the darkness and the hurting situations around us. "I've indeed seen the misery of my people. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them. God himself actually uses the word rescue. It's interesting that he says, I've come down. This is humility language. And this is not what you expect. It's certainly not the language of the gods of the Egyptians. It's not how the Babylonians thought of deities or who God or goddesses were. You never described, never before God, Creator, revealing himself to Abraham and now to Moses, never was God thought to be the God who would come down close to us and be concerned about us and care about us. God is actually lowering himself down to broken planet Earth. What does that sound like? Does that bring any New Testament images to mind? The thought of God lowering himself down to planet Earth? So I have come down to rescue them. Rescue is a word here in the Hebrew where God, when God says rescue, this is risk language. God is saying rescue requires risk. And someone often pays a price to rescue someone who's in trouble. And I'm going to be the one who does that, says God to Moses here. When I was 11 years old, in the winter of 1982, we got news of a horrific plane crash that happened right here. It took off from National Airport, what is now Reagan National, and it was airborne just a matter of seconds before it crashed into the 14th Street Bridge. It was in the middle of a snowstorm. The Potomac River was icy. It was either completely ice covered or at least ice was floating in the river, and the plane hit the bridge and plunged into the river. And as an 11-year-old, it was horrific to everyone. But I remember in school, friends at school, we were horrified at this. And please don't let this make you afraid. Those of you who are nervous flyers, this was a long time ago. Flying is the safest way to travel, all that stuff. I don't need to say that. But I remember that night talking to my parents in front of the TV, and it was just a horrific scene. And helicopters were flying in over the ice trying to rescue people and dropping ropes. And this woman, I want to get her name right, she was a passenger in the plane, Priscilla Tirado, surfaced in the river, and she was in the water in jet fuel for 30 minutes, this freezing cold water. And when the helicopter finally got to her, her hands were so frozen, she was so cold and so numb and so in shock, she couldn't grab the rope from the safety line from the helicopter. And so this random person who's driving across the bridge and pulls over and is just watching the scene, his name is Lenny Skutnik. I wanted to make sure I said his name right. When I've referred to him, I've said Sputnik. Lenny Skutnik worked for the federal government in D.C. He's driving home. He sees this happening, and he takes off his coat without thinking. He takes off his coat, takes off his boots, and dives into the icy water. And I remember in all the horror, suddenly this heroic moment is happening. And this man becomes a hero. I mean, the Coast Guard awarded him like their highest award, and President Reagan talked about Lenny Skutnik like to the nation, and then invited him to be his guest of honor at the State of the Union speech. And I mean, media and every interview is just calling this man like a modern day hero. He dove into the water, swims out to Priscilla Tirado, and rescues her. She was safe, and she's alive today because of this hero named Lenny. And it's interesting what Lenny said. By the way, this man retired in 2010 and lives in Woodbridge, Virginia to this day, right here, like in our backyard. And after being named a hero so many times by the government and by the president and so many places, he was quoted one day as saying, "I hate being called a hero. I'd rather be called a decent human being. What I did was a human reaction like breathing and like walking." And I love this reaction. I love his response, that his idea is that this should be everyday normal behavior. We should be living to take care of each other and protecting one another and risking ourselves to help others. I just love that this is this guy's instinct. And what I wrote in my notes here is that greatness, in our world, greatness is about elevating yourself. There's this big controversy in golf today. The PGA has competition with this other golf tournament that's paying golfers so many more millions of dollars to switch and go to their league. And so much of our world defines greatness by what we accomplish or what we accumulate or how much money we make. Greatness is not elevating self over others. It was never intended to be that. Humility is the essence of humanity. Humility is the essence of humans looking and sounding like God. Humility, when we lower ourselves, when we humble ourselves for the sake of someone else, we actually look like God. We actually are speaking the language of God. We're behaving like God. Not only does Jesus do this, but we see way back in the Old Testament, God's strategy was to come down and to be the rescuer of those who had become selfish and those who had taken control or tried to take control away from God, or we made ourselves the center of the universe. God loves us so much, he became the rescuer and he lowered himself to rescue us from the Israelites from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Again, this is Eden language. This is God's heart being revealed, that I'm ultimately going to lead humanity back to the garden, back to perfect, flawless creation, what we all crave, where there's no more death and there's no more bullying and there's no more anxiety and depression that so overrides the freedom that we crave to live. That all of it is gone, all of it has been defeated and buried by God, who's figured out a way to lead us back to life, like whole life, full life. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, God says to Moses, so now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. All right. Now, go is engagement language. God is saying to Moses, it's time to leave the far side of the wilderness. And you're going to come out of the wilderness, Moses, when you participate in my plan. When you engage, when you get in the game, when you become part of my rescue plan, you will no longer be in the wilderness. In fact, I'm leading you to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the good that I have for you. And you're going to help lead people toward that good. There's several reasons we tend to not hear this now go as for us, or we tend to read right over it, or presume or pretend that it's not for us or for people like you and me. Or that it's something that I just can't do anything about. I can't help people. I'm trying to figure God out on my own, or I don't understand Scripture or the full content of the Bible. I don't understand a lot of it. Who am I that God would use me to speak life into someone else's life, or to lead them out of something troubling or hard or bad into good and beauty? And we're going to see that Moses is in that struggle right here. There's a couple of reasons we do this. We just don't think it applies to us. I want to use you, or Brad, go, or whatever your name is, John or Sally or Kumar or Alton, now go. We tend to overlook this or presume it's not for me or pretend it's not for us. First of all, because we tend to think that going means going far away. And it doesn't necessarily mean far away. In fact, Moses is asked by God to go to what is familiar to him, to his people, the palace that he was raised in. Moses is actually part of Pharaoh's family. We tend to hear action language from God, or we hear God calling us to act or to participate or to get in the game as this kind of mission language as missionary language. Like, I used to think that when I was young in my faith, like if I'm really serving God, I've got to not have a job and I need to move to some faraway village on another continent. Sometimes God is calling you and me to engage with the people in the culture and the language that we're most familiar with. In fact, that's usually what he calls us to. Now go, in Moses' case, and often for our cases, now go is calling us to stop running or to stop hiding or to stop using something. In Moses' case, he kept referring to the death of the Egyptian. He killed an Egyptian in this fight years ago, and Moses thought it disqualified him being used from God. And you and I have the tendency to say, God can't use me. He needs to use somebody up on stage at church, or somebody who knows scripture better, or somebody who doesn't have this thing in their past like I do. And I love how God wants to use somebody broken and imperfect, somebody who's done something horrific and tried to cover it up in his past, somebody like Moses as part of his rescue plan. And again, it just speaks to the true heart of God, the true character of God in looking at broken humanity. But Moses replies to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites up out of Egypt?" And I love God's response to who am I or this thing, but God, there's better people or people who understand how to speak better. And God's response is simply, "I'll be with you." Moses, I'm going to ignore all of those things. I'm calling you and I'm going to be with you. Because after all, God uses us in the lives of other people, but it's really his power. It's his love. It's him at work through us that changes someone or compels someone or gives someone hope. All right, in our last remaining time here, I want to just fast forward to the New Testament. The language in the New Testament at Jesus' arrival. Israel could never fulfill their purpose to be a blessing to all nations, to reflect God. They kept recentering themselves as the center point of the universe. They kept making their own gods and making themselves God. And this cycle just continues to the Old Testament. And finally, Jesus comes to be Israel, to fulfill the mandate and the purpose of Israel. And so Jesus is born of the Jews, and he fulfills this. And this is the introduction of Jesus in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, the one who spoke creation, is now becoming flesh. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was not only with God, the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. This is one of the many places where we learn that Jesus was the voice of creation. Jesus actually was the creator. A lot of people think it was, God the Father, the big God that we really don't see, the older man God who created, but it was actually Jesus who created in the Genesis story, in the creation story. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And here in verse 14, in the very first few sentences of the New Testament, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. This is language, this is humility language. That God lowered himself. He came down, and he doesn't come and float in the clouds and order people around or judge people for all of what they've done wrong. He comes down to live among us, to interact personally, to hear and see and feel our human condition, and to ultimately take on himself the pain we've created and our selfishness and our selfish choosing. Now, why? Why does he do this? Why does God care so much? This takes us 2 chapters forward to John chapter 3. And John chapter 3 is where we almost always put the attention on John 3:16. God loved humanity so much that he sent his son. That whoever believes the message of his son and believes that his son is wholeness will have life, will have life forever, just like in the garden. I want to look at John 3:17. This often gets overlooked because of the verse that precedes it. John 3:17, again, is this rescue language. God did not send his son into the world to condemn it. God sent his son into the world to rescue the world through Jesus. I mean, there's the word rescue again. John goes on to say, yeah, people can reject Jesus. But it's not, make no mistake, John says, it's not Jesus rejecting certain humans or having his favorites or saying, you've done things that are so bad, I'm going to damn you forever into this place. It's not Jesus who came to reject us. John makes it clear, if there's rejection, it will be humans rejecting him as the source of wholeness and the source of life. I want to end our time here with a story that I wrote a couple years ago. I was journaling, and this is a picture. I've got I did a series of writings where I wrote 4 different pictures, word pictures, of our purpose here at Dulles Church, and this is one of the 4. And I call it Rescue from a Stormy Sea. I'm going to read this, and we're going to wrap up our time here. This is a parable that has been inspired by so many of Jesus' parables, of course. In the darkness of a stormy sea, an all-alone survivor of a shipwreck is being overcome by waves they can't even see in the absolute black of wind and chaos in the storm. This person is you, and this person is me. The storm shows us just how big our inadequacies and weaknesses are, how critical and judging of others we can be, how strong our selfishness can be, how hopeless our anxieties about the future are, how dark our own identity can be after failure, or our inability to truly love people who are not like us. This violent storm exposes the ugly of our own egos and self-promotion that leave us hollow. The waves of this storm are so relentless, we give in more and more to the idea of no lasting future of good. And then a strong hand pulls us up and into the arms of a rescuer. The rescuer risks everything in the darkness to embrace us with purpose and hope and enfolds us in love. And it's while being rescued that you now can make out and see through the mist that you're in the waves of a beach. We're actually near the coastline. He's carrying you through relentless waves onto shore, onto a sandy beach, high up on a sandy beach above the raging surf and away from the shipwreck. You're in shock. You're trying to laugh. Your lungs fill with fresh air, and you begin to scream, wow, and you're laughing, ha, I'm alive. You've saved me from my shipwreck. Thank you. And you're thanking your rescuer. He whispers that he's always been with you. He always has loved you. And he has confidence and a hopeful future for you far beyond what you can imagine. And in an instant, he stands to leave. And you lunge to grab for him, for his arm or his leg. No, wait. You're not leaving. Stay with me. Stay here. Don't leave me, you say to him. He calls back to you. Actually, I want you to come with me. But the view of the ocean, your ocean is so beautiful. Stay here with me on the beach, you say to him. He calls to you in the wind beneath the palm trees. Actually, you come with me. I need you. You call back to Jesus. No, I want to sit with you. I want to talk with you. I want to hear your stories and celebrate that you've rescued me. Jesus turns out toward the darkness of the ocean. What is he looking at? He's gazing at the shipwreck. You squint and peer out into the dark, and then you see it. You see them. There's more. There are people in the waves, beyond the waves. Oh man, wow, there are a lot of people. Jesus is already racing into the breakers, but he's calling back at you. And he's calling back to me, I need you. I want your help. But you and I are so excited to sit with our rescuer and learn from him and laugh with him and worship him. So we stay. We stay on the beach, reading about him, singing songs to him from high up on that beach. And after some weeks and months of thinking about him, reading about him, talking about him, we find ourselves forgetting now exactly what his face looked like. We try to remember what his voice sounded like. And we certainly don't admit this openly, but we sometimes wonder if we really had been shipwrecked, or if it was some kind of spiritual dream that we'd had when we were struggling or vulnerable to something. But this beach, wow, this beach, it's so beautiful. You and I start to think about building a beautiful house right here on the sand. And this, in my writing, was just a way for me to express how easily I think we, as people who've heard and been told and taught about Jesus coming and ultimately dying with our pain, our selfishness, our ugly, everything that humanity should not be that has resided in you and me, and then defeating that death. And we somehow become consumers of it. Like, wow, well, he's done this to be able to take me away to heaven someday. Not realizing the full picture that Jesus has rescued you and me and calls us to be an extension of his rescue to others as he dreams of remaking and reshaping this world back to what it was always intended to be. And so, God, today we give you our lives. We give you our hearts, our priorities, and we say yes to your call that we would go. We would go into the culture, into the language, into the spaces that we're familiar with, and we would be used by you to give hope and life and encouragement, that we would tell our story. God, that we would serve your church, the movement, your movement in this world today of good and right and beauty and reclaiming from the dark and the ugly all that you intend for people. We say yes to being part of that movement of your church, this most exciting idea on earth, the construction and building of your church, your lighthouse. God, use me. Just encourage you wherever you are to say to God, God, use me. Listen, on the Dulles mobile app this week, I encourage you, click that top link. It'll take you to a new 5-minute video. I really encourage you to watch that video this week. We're going to unpack it together here in the weeks ahead. It's a 5-minute video. I think it will really explain a lot more of what we're diving into here in the series. And then answer the questions that we pose. We ask questions related to God and his rescue plan and our involvement in it. Will you take time this week to send in to us your answers to those questions? I love you, Dulles Church, and I love being a part of his church with you. Have a great week. I'll see you next Sunday.